Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making it past the barricade of fast cars. There's a few more people joining us once they also make their way. I'm Dr. Horton. I direct the Centre for the Study of Communications and Culture at the University of Nottingham. We're very pleased to welcome you here this morning to this event, which is being held in collaboration with our good friends, the Islamic Renaissance Front. We've got a lineup of very renowned, esteemed speakers this morning, so we've got a lot of interesting things to hear and a lot of interesting things to talk about, I think, particularly given the topic and current and recent events in Malaysia. So please help me to welcome, before I pass it over to our moderator for today, Professor Meredith Weiss, Dr Helen Ting, Dr Dzulkefly Ahmad, Dr Ambiga Sreneevasan, and Dr Farouk Musa. Thank you.
Morning to everyone, and welcome to our roundtable discussion again. I know it's not a good day because of this care campaign and everything, but thank you for being here. And before I forget, don't leave before you have your lunch. Okay, it's going to be a good one. Yeah. Let me remind you. Yeah, it's supposed to be good. It's from Penang, Alright. We are going to discuss a very important topic today of civil society. And I believe many of us, we are aware that for the past 10 years or so, civil society has been becoming stronger in this country. And because of that, there's a lot of pressure upon the government to be more transparent. Although we know that they sweep many of the things under the cupboard, but they have to answer to us, to the civil societies, to per se, to many other civil societies. We have a wide range of civil societies, like working with for the rights of the indigenous, working against the Bakun Dam, working for democratization of society, working for more liberal interpretation of Islam, for example. And so civil society that are working for a more authoritarian version of Islam as well. So we cannot deny the fact, right? And of course, some of my friends in the civil society, they like to call these civil societies not as NGOs, but as Congos, government-linked civil societies, right? So whatever it is, we are going to discuss in particular with respect to Islamism, right? Because now Dr. Zul has somehow turned to be from a politician to become a civil society activist.
Relegated.
Yeah, somehow. So this is very important because we want to see whether there's any change in this paradigm of thinking, right? Or whether what is his basically aspiration for our society. And of course, we have the most renowned civil society activists that were Ambiga were here, and also panelist Dr. Helen Ting, who has been with me for a few times, and we had interfaith discussion and so on and so forth. She had presented her paper abroad as well, right? So, and our star speaker is nonetheless Professor Meredith Weiss, and I would like to welcome her to present her talk first before I open to the other panelists. Thank you.
I'll just speak from here if that's all right. And thanks very much for organizing this, Farouk, and for having me, and thanks for braving the unusual traffic circumstances to come, especially at a time when there are all sorts of very interesting forums and demonstrations and protests and all sorts of activities in civil society now that can also draw your attention. So thanks for coming out regardless on a Sunday morning. I will say that this will be more of a roundtable format than a formal talk. I don't expect the other panelists here, who I suspect are the ones you've really come to see, to be intervening in what I have to say. So instead, we'll each offer our thoughts. I've tried to structure my remarks in a way that makes clear the part that I will focus on and the part that I'm hoping the other panelists, who have much greater expertise on those aspects, might be able to explain more about than I can. So I'll start off by being a little bit perverse, perhaps, just because the goal with a session such as this is not just that a group of us sit at the front of the room, tell you something, you walk away with that, but rather that there be an active discussion. So to kick off the spirit of active discussion, I'll start by being contrary. My esteemed colleague Farouk Musa's overview for the program, which you've probably all read, starts by defining civil society as, quote, an autonomous space between the state, market, and the family, which, he notes, is believed to sustain the democratic political system due to its ability to bring citizens together, or, as he says a little bit later, because it promotes the interaction of people in a voluntary setting where differences of opinion have to be taken into account because such groups have diverse interests. So I, partly, again, just to be difficult, will take as my own starting premise partial agreement with that widely held definition, which I concede is the dominant definition of civil society. So in other words, yes, but. We might quibble with each part of this definition. So what do we mean by autonomous? You've already heard mention of GONGOs, government-oriented NGOs, but is a welfare organization that accepts state funds for its programs autonomous? Perhaps if it sets its own agenda, it's that it's devolving tasks from the state to civil society because of greater access or expertise, but so long as the organization itself determines on what it will focus or the communities it will address, maybe then it still counts as civil society. But what if an organization accepts foundation support from any international or domestic charitable group or philanthropic organization or business or whatever else, not the state, some independent funder? But what if that organization knows that certain aspects or certain perspectives are more likely to get funded? So while that organization sets its own agenda, the agenda is implicitly shaped by the need to attract funding. Is that still autonomous? Is that still civil society? Moreover, what if the activity in question is not so much between state, market, and family, these spheres, as overlapping 2 or 3 of these spheres? Is that civil society? We have such a problematic embodied person here in the shape of Dr. Zul, who is a member of political society, a member of government, but also civil society. YB Teresa Kalk in the audience exemplifies the same problematic, active equally, and with, one might say, equal impact, both in religious and other civil societal activities and in state activities, in political action. And so in that sense, we can recognize that these are not separate spheres, but implicitly, necessarily overlapping and mutually interactive. Perhaps most importantly, and the part on which I'll focus today, civil society matters for democracy, to pick up another of our lead terms for the day, for more than just bringing people together, facilitating collective action, and facilitating or forcing interaction. Particularly when we add ideology into the mix, for instance, Islamism. Institutions of civil society may be just as polarized or as accommodating as any other political spaces. And yet, civil society is part of democracy. Indeed, it is part of any but the most successfully totalitarian of regimes. And to be clear, by totalitarian, I mean not Najib's Malaysia, but Pol Pot's Cambodia. I should note that I think maybe I'm less pessimistic than Farouk about the compatibility of Islamism and civil society, because I come at this as a political scientist, right? Let alone democracy. In my reading, Islamist organizations are by definition part of civil society. Their specific ideology does not shift that structural placement, and there is no inherent reason to consider Islamism any more or less exclusivist or otherwise inimical to democracy, antagonistic to democracy, than any other grand ism. But Islamism per se will not be my key focus. I will leave that to my co-panelists, especially Dr. Zul, I'm guessing. So what is the relationship between civil society and democracy? I quite agree with Farouk's and with most theorists' conceptualization of civil society as a space. Every now and then you'll hear some media account that talks about civil society as though it's a discrete organization. That's not quite correct. right? Civil society is a space, okay? And in this space, we find civil society organizations. They may be NGOs or voluntary welfare organizations or associations oriented around whatever lines or linked together in movements, as well as individuals who participate directly or indirectly in collective action. They may come to a forum, they may sign a petition, they may join a protest, may contribute suggestions that spark thought and action, among others. We should consider public intellectuals as part of civil society. But that's just the structural understanding. Civil society also comprises a range of ideological perspectives and ideas. It is at this level that Islamism fits in, as one of many possible organizing principles for socio-political life, whether in terms of specifically Islamist organizations, or simply a set of values and priorities that guide individual or collective action. Rare is the ism, the ideology, that is exclusive of other isms, however. An ideology is an interpretive framework. It's a way of making sense of the world. One may be guided by Catholicism as well as nationalism, or Islamism as well as social democracy, or economic liberalism as well as neoconservatism. Moreover, one hashes out these perspectives, both in one's own mind and in conversation with others, across and between all the three spheres, state, market, family, and civil society, if we see this as an equal sphere, a fourth. In a democracy specifically, civil society offers a space conducive to collective action on a scale wider than the family, but guided not necessarily by economic logic or by the goal of seeking political office. That's what really distinguishes these spheres. It's really the level and the goal of action. But action through each of the various channels available, electoral politics, business, civil society, family, may, and really should be ideologically consistent, to move in the same direction, be guided by that same interpretive framework, even if others around us have other interpretive frameworks guiding their action. So in other words, in a democracy, we can see civil society and electoral politics as different structural arenas or avenues toward the same ideological goals. Authoritarian states may be understood not just in terms of the lack of elections, but specifically, they lack the free and fair electoral arena found in liberal democracies, yet engagement in civil society there likewise complements engagement through whatever structural channels are available, from enfeebled elections to other parts of political society like the courts to business networks. So for instance, Sherry Berman, who I've noticed Ambiga Consulting, has argued that even prisons, when you have large numbers of political prisoners locked up together, we develop this sort of political learning and the civil society that forms in prisons among political prisoners. That it's a fantastic environment for exchanging ideas. So that's why I say in any but the absolute most totalitarian of societies, we'll still have civil society as one arena for collective exchange of ideas, mobilization, and engagement. All right? And so one may genuinely value civil society without preferring democracy. Though the reverse does not hold true. Civil society is an essential attribute of democracy. It is not exclusive to democracies, but it is necessary to democracy. To get a little bit more directly political, we have all been perhaps startled, some maybe more than startled, to hear of late quite frequent references to, quote, undermining parliamentary democracy, seemingly defined in terms of engaging in political action outside electoral politics. I am no lawyer, so I will leave authoritative legal reasoning to my more competent co-panelist who is one. But rather, from a political scientist perspective, this charge of undermining parliamentary democracy is puzzling. And I realize I'm not the first to point that out. The way parliamentary democracy is being operationalized suggests a false assumption that democracy could ever begin and end with parliament. That is never the case. The term parliamentary is an adjective modifying democracy, indicating an institutional framework for representative rather than direct participation. It's parliamentary democracy rather than presidential democracy, which is a different institutional framework, rather than direct democracy, which is another institutional framework. But there is more to democracy than just its legislative framework. Democracy also necessarily entails at least a baseline level of civil liberties and political freedoms, however much institutional frameworks or structures differ. By the same token, a host of ideologies, priorities, and so forth are compatible with democracy, so long as their operationalization, their praxis, recognizes the central premises of equal ability to select one's government and equality under law. Within any democracy, some aims are better pursued via institutional politics, in Malaysia by parliament, and other aims via non-institutional politics, as we refer to associational activity and the like. And that brings me back to what civil society means for democracy. First, civil society offers space for strategic innovation. Politicians have a limited tool set. Essentially, they contest for seats and they legislate. Yes, they may perform various forms of constituency service, may themselves engage in civil society, be active in a mosque or a church, support campaigns, and so forth. But in terms of fulfilling that part of their role, that identity that is politician, they seek, secure, and perform the functions of public office. Activists in civil society are not similarly constrained. They specifically do not perform those roles. So they can instead pursue the same policy objectives, for instance, via very different strategies, from organizing self-help groups outside the state, to drafting proposals to present to those who are in office through lobbying or other forms of engagement, to organizing strikes and boycotts. Activists in civil society, in other words, have the freedom and the cost, the limitations, of working outside rigid institutions. They are not guaranteed efficacy or influence, but they are not limited by rules of parliamentary procedure. They are forced to be creative, to make sure that the strategy they choose is appropriate to their aim, that they force the correct actors to take notice by appropriately linking target and approach. Second, civil society offers space both for cross-cutting alliances, mass campaigns, in which we try to bring everyone on board, and for occupying a small niche. It is not incumbent on civil society organizations to represent anyone. They are not elected. Again, that's a plus and a minus. An elected MP is required to represent those that he or she is elected to serve. Okay, there's a principal agent problem there. Do you represent just those who elected you? Do you represent all? But that's really decided as part of a broader social contract. Who gives the mandate? To whom is that mandate? Generally speaking, in a parliamentary democracy, the understanding is that those elected represent all of society and not just the specific people who elected them. Okay? That's what we would term a programmatic political approach, as opposed to a more clientelistic or contingent political approach. It's considered more democratic. Right? But that doesn't apply to a civil society organization. They are, by definition, voluntary. Okay? So these groups, civil society organizations, may have obligations to society or to donors, but that's a structurally different sort of accountability. They may choose to be accountable also to citizens, to all or some, but again, it's a structurally different connection. So in other words, within civil society, because of that structural form, everyone need not agree or feel represented by any given organization. And that means, too, that there need not, indeed cannot, ever be a women's movement, or a students' movement, or a progressive movement, since groups pitched toward a particular segment will, of course, not share all priorities and preferences with groups pitched toward a different segment, or aiming for the unifying lowest common denominator. In other words, the cost and the benefit of civil society is that we can have both mass encompassing groups at that lowest common denominator. What's the issue that holds us together? And groups that aim toward a particular niche or a specific goal. Third and finally, a polity cannot have a well-functioning democracy if all collective action is via parties or oriented around elections. Okay? So this claim by Mahathir and so many others who would like it to be this way, that democracy means voting. Once every 5 years you give a mandate and you be quiet. That's not actually what democracy means. Those of you here probably know that, I assume. However, electoral politics is also essential to democracy. It's also part of the definition. Having that space for prior, simultaneous, and subsequent deliberation and mobilization is essential, not just to avoid overloading the system by an impossible multitude of demands. You know, even an activist from civil society who becomes elected quickly discovers that they cannot focus so single-mindedly on this one key issue that used to be their primary focus once they're in office and responsible to, accountable to all voters. But so both of these are necessary. Space for discussion, for coordination, for simplifying demands so that they can be digested by the electoral political system. That's necessary. But Parliament is also necessary to this. So Parliament is not the right venue to hash out some of the debates that members of society need to have. Non-institutional politics is still politics and is still intrinsic to the system. It is just not that part of the system in which binding public policies are made. By the same token, in a functioning democracy, certain tasks are the ambit of institutional politics. Because civil society activists are not bound or expected to be accountable to all citizens, it should be the purview of legislatures to enact, and state administrations and judiciaries to enforce public policies. Change of leaders, too, happens in a democracy in the domain of electoral politics. When citizens talk of ousting a leader, not referring to any specific citizens, but when citizens talk of that, not by parliamentary vote of confidence or a general election, but by non-institutional means, whether that be street protests or people's parliament or something else, that is a sign of the absence or collapse of representative democracy. It is not then the case that activists are undermining democracy. This is not part of the democratic process in a representational form, but it means that they are not living in a functioning democracy in which they understand those structural mechanisms to work as they are intended to operate. Likewise, if the space of civil society is overly segmented along partisan lines, if it's assumed that civil societal activists will rally always or in a coordinated fashion along one or another party platform, okay, driven not by whatever their specific issues are, but only by the macro-structural, the large political issues of the day, or being overly pushed to compromise rather than permitting diverse perspectives to proliferate. Or if civil society lacks the autonomy, the possibility for strategic or innovation, or the possibility for self-definition that we assume in a democracy, then civil society is weak. It cannot perform all the functions within its potential. So we need to evaluate both. Is the representative, the electoral part of parliamentary democracy, or democracy of any form, is that weak or strong, and is civil society weak or strong? Both are necessary to democracy, but they work in coordinating rather than completely overlapping ways. As for where Malaysia fits, strong or weak democracy, strong or weak civil society, I will not answer that. Instead, I will expect that the rest of this morning's discussion will give us lots of chance to assess that from our other panelists as well as from those of you in the audience. I'll stop there.